Imagine a machine so important that your smartphone, AI servers, modern cars, medical scanners, and even GPS satellites depend on it. And only one company on Earth knows how to build it. That company is ASML, a Dutch giant whose machines can cost hundreds of millions of dollars. But the really crazy part is this. ASML's superpower isn't actually the machine itself. It's the light inside the machine. And now, scientists have demonstrated a completely different way to produce that same incredibly difficult light. Could this eventually crack one of the strongest technology monopolies on Earth? Let's find out. Every advanced computer chip begins with a surprisingly simple idea. You shine light onto a silicon wafer through an incredibly precise pattern, and that light creates microscopic structures on the chip. Make those structures smaller, and you can squeeze more transistors into the same space, which generally means more powerful and efficient processors. But there's a catch. To make smaller patterns, you need shorter wavelength light. ASML uses something called extreme ultraviolet, or EUV, with a wavelength of just 13.5 nanometers. For perspective, a human hair is roughly 80,000 nanometers wide. So yes, we're talking about light that makes your hair look like a highway. The problem is that useful EUV light doesn't naturally sit around waiting to be collected. It has to be manufactured. ASML's solution is almost absurdly complicated. Tiny droplets of molten tin are fired through a vacuum chamber roughly 50,000 times every second. A powerful laser hits each droplet twice, first flattening it, then turning it into an extremely hot plasma. That plasma produces the precious 13.5 nanometer EUV light. And the temperature? Around 200,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun. But creating the light is only half the battle. The process produces tin debris, requires hydrogen to clean the chamber, damages expensive optics, and wastes enormous amounts of light along the way. That brings us to the real question. What if you could produce the same EUV light without exploding tiny pieces of tin thousands of times every second? That is where a radically different idea called Steady-State Microbunching enters the story, and where ASML's seemingly untouchable bottleneck starts getting very interesting. Now here's where the story takes a serious turn. Instead of firing lasers at tiny tin droplets, researchers are exploring something that sounds more like a particle physics experiment than a chip factory. Imagine a giant circular racetrack, but instead of racing cars, you have electrons moving around it at almost the speed of light. As electrons travel through this ring, they naturally emit light. The problem is that normally the electrons are spread out in relatively large bunches, producing light that is useful for scientific research but nowhere near powerful or controlled enough for high-volume chip manufacturing. Then, scientists found a way to change the game. Using carefully controlled lasers and a device called an undulator, they can push the electrons into incredibly tiny groups called microbunches. These bunches can be roughly 1 micrometer long, about 1,000 times smaller than the original electron bunches. And that changes how the electrons behave. Instead of producing weak scattered light independently, the electrons begin radiating in sync. Their electromagnetic waves reinforce one another, producing much more powerful coherent radiation. Think of a stadium where everyone is shouting at random. You get noise, but get thousands of people to shout the exact same word at exactly the same moment, and suddenly the entire building shakes. That is essentially the trick behind steady-state microbunching, or SSMB. And the contrast with ASML is fascinating. ASML's current approach repeatedly creates EUV light through microscopic tin plasma explosions. SSMB attempts to create a continuous laser-like EUV source from circulating electrons, with no tin droplets, no exploding plasma, and potentially far less debris. The theoretical numbers are especially interesting. Research has described a path toward EUV sources capable of reaching kilowatt-level average power. ASML's current systems operate at hundreds of watts, while the company has been working towards substantially higher power levels in the coming years. But there's another possibility here that could be even more disruptive. ASML places a dedicated light source inside each lithography machine. A particle storage ring approach could potentially work very differently. Instead of giving every scanner its own enormous light engine, One large accelerator could potentially supply EUV light to multiple exposure stations positioned around it. One powerful source, multiple machines. That could completely change the economics of advanced chip manufacturing. And suddenly, the word bottleneck becomes even more important. Because if the light source can be separated from the scanner and shared across an entire facility, the most expensive component no longer has to be duplicated for every machine. But before we start celebrating the end of ASML's monopoly, there is an important question. Where did this idea actually come from? The concept of steady-state microbunching dates back to around 2010, when accelerator physicist Alexander Chow and his student Daniel Ratner developed the theory. For years, however, it remained largely theoretical because researchers lacked the right equipment to properly test it. Then, a young physicist working at Tsinghua University in Beijing pushed the mathematics further and helped move the idea toward an actual experiment. And this is where the story gets surprisingly international. The critical experiment did not take place in China. It happened in Germany. Researchers connected with accelerator specialists in Germany, including teams associated with PTB and the Helmholtz Center in Berlin. They gained access to the metrology light source, a specialized electron ring capable of testing the unusual operating conditions required for SSMB. Then, in February 2021, the international team published its results in Nature. They had demonstrated the essential principle. An electron beam could be microbunched and produce radiation in the way the theory predicted. That was not a production-ready chip-making system. But scientifically, it was a major milestone. The idea had moved from equations on paper to something that could actually be demonstrated in the real world. And that creates a problem for the assumption behind today's semiconductor restrictions. For years, the strategy was straightforward. Control access to ASML's EUV machines, and you control access to the most advanced chip-making technology. But what happens if the same 13.5 nanometer light can eventually be produced through a completely different physical approach? That doesn't mean ASML has lost, far from it. But it means the road to advanced chips may no longer have only one possible route. But proving the physics is possible and building a machine that can manufacture millions of chips are two very different things. And this is where the story gets much more complicated. The 2021 SSMB experiment was a proof of principle. It showed that the concept works, but the electron beam used in the experiment was nowhere near the power and scale required for a commercial semiconductor factory. In other words, scientists had started the engine, but they had not exactly taken the family road trip yet. Turning that experiment into a reliable industrial EUV source would require enormous advances in power, stability, precision, and engineering. And then there is the biggest monster of them all, yield. Making EUV light is one challenge. Using that light to print billions of microscopic structures with almost no defects is another. Everything has to work with extraordinary precision. Mirrors need to be aligned almost perfectly. The optical system has to remain stable. The photoresist materials on the wafer have to behave exactly as expected. Even tiny errors can reduce the number of usable chips produced from a wafer. This is one reason ASML's advantage is much bigger than simply owning an EUV light source. The company spent decades developing the complete ecosystem around EUV lithography. Its machines combine thousands of highly specialized components and technologies. ASML itself relies on an international network of suppliers. German companies provide crucial technologies, including the powerful lasers and ultra-precise optics, while the EUV light source technology has roots in the California company Cymer, which ASML acquired. The difficult part isn't merely building one working prototype. It is making the entire system operate continuously, reliably, and economically inside a real semiconductor factory. And China faces another enormous challenge: scaling the accelerator itself. Reports have described work on a proposed electron ring facility in Shanghai's Zhangjiang area, with a ring potentially around 100 to 150 meters in circumference. That is not a gadget you put together over a weekend. It is closer to constructing a giant scientific facility, and then asking it to become part of one of the most demanding manufacturing industries on Earth. Meanwhile, another player has entered the race. In the United States, a startup called Xlight is pursuing a related accelerator-based approach, using a large particle accelerator and free electron laser technology to generate EUV light and potentially feed multiple lithography systems from a shared source. The US government committed $150 million to the effort through the CHIPS and Science Act, while former Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger became involved with the company. The target is ambitious: a test system around 2028 and potentially connecting 20 or more printing machines to a single light source. So this isn't simply China versus ASML anymore. Scientists and companies in different countries are exploring the same fundamental question. What if the future of EUV doesn't require tin at all? And if someone solves that problem at industrial scale, the consequences could reach far beyond one company. Because ASML's extraordinary position exists partly because EUV is extraordinarily difficult. But if another technology can produce powerful, reliable EUV light, then the bottleneck begins to weaken. And once a bottleneck starts disappearing, an entire industry's economics can change. That is exactly why this experiment matters, even if commercial machines are still years away. So, does this mean ASML's monopoly is already finished? No. And anyone telling you that probably skipped the most important part of the story. SSMB has demonstrated something incredibly important, but there is still a gigantic distance between proving a physics concept and operating a semiconductor factory around it 24 hours a day. Remember, ASML spent roughly 3 decades turning EUV from something many scientists considered nearly impossible into a commercial technology. A competing EUV system has to survive that same brutal journey. It must produce enough power, remain stable, protect its optics, work with sophisticated semiconductor materials, integrate with lithography equipment, and, most importantly, produce chips with extremely high yields. That final step is where the real battle will be fought. But there is something even more important here. The breakthrough doesn't need to replace ASML tomorrow to matter. Its biggest impact may be psychological and strategic. For years, ASML represented a bottleneck that appeared almost impossible to bypass. If you wanted the most advanced lithography technology, there was essentially one supplier and one road. Now, scientists have demonstrated that another road may exist. It is still unfinished. It may take many years. It may become far more expensive or complicated than expected. There could be engineering problems that today's experiments haven't revealed. But the door is no longer completely closed, and that matters enormously for China. The United States and the Netherlands have built semiconductor restrictions around controlling access to advanced manufacturing equipment, particularly ASML's EUV systems. The logic was straightforward. If advanced lithography equipment cannot be obtained, producing the most advanced chips becomes dramatically harder. But if China eventually develops a different method for producing EUV light, that strategy becomes less powerful. It could also change the economics of the semiconductor industry. Today, an advanced EUV machine can cost hundreds of millions of dollars. ASML's newest high-end A systems are reported at roughly $380 million each. Imagine changing the model so that one enormous accelerator-based light source could potentially serve many exposure stations. Instead of putting one incredibly expensive light source inside every machine, you could potentially distribute the cost across an entire facility. That could make advanced lithography cheaper, or at least create a completely different manufacturing architecture. And suddenly, the word we started with comes back one final time: bottleneck. A monopoly over a bottleneck is incredibly powerful, but only while the bottleneck exists. That is the real significance of the research demonstrated in Berlin. It didn't destroy ASML. It didn't produce a Chinese EUV scanner. It didn't suddenly put next-generation chips into everyone's phones. What it did was much more subtle. It demonstrated that the physics does not necessarily require ASML's exact solution. And that is a very dangerous idea for any monopoly. There are already huge amounts of money and scientific talent being directed toward alternative approaches. China has invested billions into developing its own semiconductor ecosystem, while American researchers are pursuing accelerator-based EUV concepts of their own. So the future may not be a simple story where one company wins and everyone else disappears. We could instead see multiple competing approaches to advanced lithography. ASML may continue improving its tin plasma technology and remain dominant for years. Another country might eventually develop accelerator-based EUV. A completely different technology could appear afterward and make both approaches look outdated. That is how technological monopolies usually become vulnerable. The machine that makes the world's most advanced chips still comes from one Dutch company. The monopoly is still real. The billions in revenue are still real. The hundreds of millions of dollars machines are still being shipped. But now there is something new in the equation, an alternative. And alternatives are where monopolies become nervous. Because physics doesn't care about export controls, national borders, or corporate market share. If scientists can find another path to the same result, engineers will eventually try to build it. Maybe it takes 5 years, maybe 10, maybe much longer. Maybe it fails completely. But the important thing is that the question has changed. We are no longer asking, can anyone ever find another way? We are asking, who will be the first to make that other way commercially useful? And if someone succeeds, the consequences won't stay inside a laboratory. They could affect the price of advanced chips, the AI industry, smartphones, cars, data centers, national security, and the global balance of semiconductor power. So the next time you pick up your phone and wonder how something this tiny can perform billions of calculations every second, remember the enormous technological battle happening behind that screen. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that subscribe button, because apparently even light has a geopolitical career now. And tell me in the comments, do you think accelerator-based EUV can eventually challenge ASML, or will ASML stay ahead for decades?